You'd honestly have to wonder if you were a Daily Mail reader and you'd fallen out of love with Boris Johnson, especially over the whole Partygate affair, reading this particular article, in which it feels as almost if the Daily Mail is singing Don't Cry for Me, Boris Johnson. You'd have to wonder, or even hope, that they were asking themselves, is it just me that feels this way, or is it just the rest of the world that seems to have gone a bit crazy? Luckily, it's not you, nor is it the world. No, of course, it's the Daily Mail, because who else was going to sing the praises of Boris Johnson? And that's why I think going over this is going to be the best way to do it, because not only does this leave huge segments out of what was going on at the time, that of course throws accusations that it was never Boris Johnson who was ultimately responsible for his own downfall, which he absolutely was, which we'll get into here. But instead, they throw the blame at the Remainers, the jealous MPs who didn't like Boris Johnson. It was the Mandarins who couldn't understand Boris Johnson's grand plan for the UK. No, the people who were responsible for Boris Johnson were at fault, not Boris Johnson. And as we said just a moment ago, there's only one person responsible for the downfall of Boris Johnson. And of course, well, that's Boris Johnson. So today we're going to head over for first time in quite a while, to be honest, to have a look at what seems to be the political, not obituary for Boris Johnson, but if only they hadn't got rid of Johnson, oh, we wouldn't. But as always, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and an notification link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And of course, thank you very much to all those people who do help support the channel that way. And of course, the Pony Club is down below as well. So let's go over to the Daily Mail and have a look at this. So this is written by Daniel Johnson with the title of "The Nation Has Lost a Transformative Political Genius Who's Like We Won't See Again." You can call Johnson a lot of things, but a transformative political genius? Oh, no. No. Absolutely. Absolutely not. So, he changed the course of history, but in the end, they got him. Having dominated the political stage for a decade, Boris Johnson was brought down by the envy of Westminster and the spite of Whitehall. Absolutely not. No one was envying Johnson in Westminster, and it was not Whitehall that brought Boris Johnson down. It was Boris Johnson, and I will keep on saying that because it is absolutely true. Boris brought Boris down because it was the exact way he had always acted. And as we always said back in the heyday of when Johnson first came into the seat, sooner or later, there will just be scandal after scandal after scandal, which is what happened. And there will just be one too many, and they'll have to get rid of him. And that's exactly what happened. When Johnson was under the spotlight of the Prime Minister, he could not get away with the just continuing scandal machine that he is. So I'll remind you once again, it was not the envy of Westminster and it was not the spite of Whitehall that brought down Boris Johnson. It was Boris Johnson. So he continues. Boris was different. He was the first celebrity to become Prime Minister, and there was always plenty of jealous parliamentary Lilliputians trying to tie down this Gulliver of politics. Okay. So who are these jealous parties? Who are these jealous parliamentarians then? I would hope you would illuminate us and what they were so jealous about Boris Johnson about. But I'm sure you'll illuminate us with your Gulliverian antics. But we'll see. Boris was also the first to shun the establishment serpentine way of doing business in favor of trusting the instincts of the public. He was never forgiven for either. Um, so absolutely not. Boris Johnson is absolutely a creature of of Westminster, of the way of doing business. The thing is, Boris just went away in a bit more bombastic way than normal. And the idea of he would trust the public, well, look at how the public has turned against Brexit. Is he going to sort of trust them on that as well? Is he going to, you know, that and the idea that he is liked at this moment in time is completely wrong. Boris Johnson's stock has taken a huge tumble and will continue. No one will like Boris Johnson. So when the history books come to be written, oh, this is laying it on thick. Johnson will tower like a titan above his contemporaries, above all for delivering Brexit. Um, Boris Johnson did nothing but deliver Brexit. And if he is known for delivering Brexit, he will be known for delivering a absolutely abysmal Brexit, one that Rishi Sunak had to fix, one that future prime ministers are going to have to fix. Because as we see now from poll after poll after poll, people did not want the Brexit that Boris Johnson was delivered, and certainly one even more recently saying explicitly they want closer ties to Europe. They want the UK to work with Europe more, which essentially means more deals and eventually a return probably to the single market and customs union and eventually back into the EU. That was always the way it was going to happen. And eventually, when Brexit gets overturned, and it will sooner or later get overturned, people like this guy are going to absolutely cry. And I'll tell you what, it will be hilarious to see the tears of Boris Johnson overturning his precious Brexit. So, having won the referendum, then routed the naysayers who doubted Britain's ability to flourish outside the single market. That's very much debatable, given again the state of our economy at the moment. The fact that our exports have tumbled drastically. You know, that's not going to be true. Boris then fought a general election on a simple slogan: "Get Brexit done," and he didn't get Brexit done. There was still lots of complications. There was still complications to it now. So he had won that by a landslide with a majority of over 80 seats, while Labour then collapsed. The new electoral map had Conservative MPs, lots of them, in regions where they had not been seen since the 1930s. And most of those Conservative MPs are going to lose their next seat at the next general election because of the promises that Boris Johnson made about levelling up and then did not deliver. To grasp the significance of Boris Johnson's achievement, it is not enough to imagine the past few years without him. In all likelihood, there would have been no Brexit, no Tory triumph in 2019, and no rallying of the West to defend Ukraine. So, first of all three of those are absolutely wrong. There probably would have been Brexit in some way, shape, or form. Probably not as hard as Brexit as we would have had, which would have caused the Brexiteers to constantly cry betrayal. And even now, we've got a pretty hard Brexit, and even now, it's not Brexity enough for them. So that's completely not true. No Tory triumph in 2019. That probably is true. Like I say, people forget going into the 2019 general election, the Tory landscape, and the number one reason why they brought Boris Johnson in 2019 was they thought he was the only guy who could potentially win and beat Corbyn at the time. So that is probably the only truth that you will get at that point. And of course, no rallying the West to defend Ukraine. Well, again, that's not 100% true. From what we know from inside stories, certainly about that time, Boris had no interest in going to help and support Ukraine. It was Ben Wallace who marched into Boris Johnson's office, from what we know, and said, "You will support Ukraine or else I will resign." And of course, Boris then ended up having to support Ukraine and kind of liked it, in fact, of that whole Churchillian factor. Um, but rallying the West to defend Ukraine, all on the shoulders of Boris Johnson, no. The West would have rallied to help Ukraine with or without Johnson. So Downing Street can now be occupied by Jeremy Corbyn and his sinister anti-Semites. Vladimir Putin would not be in retreat. Again, that's highly doubtful that he would be. And again, Corbyn would probably in. And again, I don't think the whole thing with the anti-Semite accusations really necessarily stands. That was to be honest, at the time, it always was and is sort of a big sort of smear against Jeremy Corbyn that, well, the right heavily ran with. Were the problems in the party at that time? Yes, we can see that. But again, yeah, that's nothing but a spear once again against Corbyn. But there you go. And of course, Britain would be in the thrall to Brussels. Again, no, we would probably got Brexit in some way, shape, or form. But again, that continues the whole "ooh, evil Brussels" type of thing. Yet, despite his famous victories, Boris had been forced out, first out of office, then out of Parliament by his own colleagues. Yes, because he continued to make screw up after screw up after screw up, and he was specifically told, "One more time, and you're out," because he was damaging the reputation of the Tory party to no end. The idea that this guy seemed to think that if only Boris had stayed in, that the fortunes of the Tory party would be far better off than they are now. Oh no, absolutely not. Boris would be absolutely taking a pounding in the polls at the moment. But there you go. The dream, of course, only if Boris was here, this wouldn't be happening. So rather than be deemed a liar by the Privilege Committee, well, to be honest, that's too late. They've already pretty much deemed him a liar from what we know from some of the stuff coming out of it. Then hounded out of the Commons by weasels who owe their very existence as MPs to him. To be honest, some of the biggest critics of Boris Johnson have been actually the Northern MPs, and they have been criticizing him because Boris did not fulfill his promise to level up, to give them the cash to level up their areas. That is why they have been really annoyed that Boris has not kept that promise, because that's what they were elected on. That's the entire reason, especially at the next election, when they go back and they stood on this promise of, we're going to level up this area, we're going to make this area better. They've got nothing to show for it. And that's not just on Boris, that's on Rishi Sunak as well. So Boris chose to leave politics with dignity, not judging by his resignation letter. We should be in no doubt, however, that the nation has lost, we haven't lost anything, to be honest, by the loss of Boris Johnson, a transformative political genius whose like we shall not see again. Absolutely not. He was not a political genius, and he was not in any way transformative. Shakespeare, as usual, put it best. Why, man, doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we, the petty men, walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Not really the best quote to describe Boris Johnson. I think the best Shakespeare quote for Boris Johnson was, he was nothing but a cream-faced loon. Again, thinking of, Shakespeare insults there. It took more than the mere disloyalty of his party to undermine such a tribune of the people, more popular at his zenith than any prime minister since Winston Churchill. Of course, well, we don't talk about the little plummet that he took, of course, after the whole Partygate stuff. The idea that his own MPs were disloyal. This was something that Boris had very much encouraged under Theresa May and even loved to do himself. He promised everything to everyone and he was not delivering. And sooner or later, they would have come after him. They would have absolutely come after him. All these different factions, when he had promised them to everything, no, they would have come after him. And eventually, they would have taken him down. So it was the machinations of the Mandarins, the relentless sniping of the anti-Brexit media, the revenge of the Remainers. This all played the part in Caesar's assassination. Absolutely not. If you want to use a Shakespeare analogy, Shakespeare essentially stabbed himself in the back. That's what really happened. That's what really happened to Caesar. If you're going to analogize to Boris Johnson, then it was Caesar essentially stabbing himself in the back, and then you're now blaming all those other Roman senators who weren't in, who were at the other side of the hall at the time, looking, "What on earth is he doing?" So, from the moment in late March of 2020, when he had almost succumbed to COVID, again we know that's not true now, creating a temporary power vacuum, Boris was on the back foot. No sooner was he restored to health than the curse of Dominic Cummings and his ill-fated excursion to Bernard Castle gave the PM's enemies their opportunity. Well, again, we knew what was happening in number 10 at this point from, again, if you've read Johnson at number 10, you know that Johnson had absolutely lost control long before even that had happened. Cummings, again, according to some people here, was on the point of basically a nervous breakdown. He couldn't hack it. So he decided to go on a journey, hence the whole Bernard Castle thing. And to be honest, like I say, it was Boris Johnson who decided to bring in Dominic Cummings. If he wanted to get rid of him earlier or not bring him at all, which again, many people were advising him against to. Again, if you read Johnson at number 10, that was all on Johnson, and Johnson gave Cummings power because Johnson had no interest in doing the job of the prime minister. He wanted to sort of delegate and give more power to other people, and he gave a lot of power to Dominic Cummings. So from then on, Boris was obliged to then devote large portions of time defending himself against the rising tide of, quote, trivial accusations, all of which were magnified into major scandals by a hostile press. No, these were not trivial accusations. This was Boris Johnson who broke the law after laying it down to everyone else. Here we are. So Boris was different. He was like the very first celebrity to become prime minister, and we were always plenty of jealous. Oh no, hang on. I've already read that part. Well, so this incessant barrage of balderdash diverted the beleaguered Boris from consolidating what should have been his momentum, Britain's recovery of its independence from the European Union. Uh, Boris was in charge. He had everything. This is what we have heard for all the time. Oh, we're not doing Brexit properly. Again, Boris was in charge. He had a full majority. He could have done all this stuff you wanted him to. He just chose not to. Again, there is no person to blame for that than Boris Johnson. So those who profess their disappointment in the squandered opportunities of Brexit should at least consider how adverse the conditions inherited by Boris actually were. The mammoth task of making a success of Brexit was made infinitely harder by the pandemic and the restrictions in response, in which, in turn, precipitated both an economic slump and a political crisis. Well, here's the thing. At the time, everyone was saying Brexit is going to be this massive political challenge in terms of what you want us to do. But there's also this pandemic coming along at the same time. Are you sure you want to run these side by side? Are you sure you don't want to say, look, because of the pandemic, because of everything's going on, we're going to push the date back? Even the EU was saying, yeah, because of the pandemic, are you sure you want to do Brexit still? Not, maintain some of that, security, not do this while there's the pandemic and also sort of the biggest change to, well, the UK statute book and laws since, well, the end of World War II, that was on Boris. He could have, if he wanted to, extend that, but he didn't decide to do that. So, with hindsight, and though there were quote, though some were wiser at the time, it is clear that the Bank of England printed too much money, which the Treasury then spent on over-generous handouts, while interest rates rose too little too late. So that is a clear dig at furlough. Oh, you're handing out too much money, which if you didn't, people would have been far worse off. This is what people tend to go. They hate what happened with furlough, hate what happened with the government response for sort of supporting businesses, supporting people, keeping them in work. Because as we said at the time, one of the big criticisms was Sunak is showing that socialism works. The government and Boris are showing that socialism works. That if the government hands out money to people, that it's a good thing, can have a good effect. They hated that. And this guy clearly does as well. It would, though, be unfair to blame Boris for the cost of living crisis. Absolutely not. Boris does absolutely have a responsibility for the cost of living crisis. His trusted and his chancellor Rishi Sunak and the experts in Whitehall got to try and get the balance right. All were living with the inflationary consequences of their mistakes. Again, of course, blame it all on the pandemic response. Again, while the pandemic has a response, you've also got to add Brexit into that mix as well, which we know is having a big effect on this as well. The political crisis began began sooner than the economic one. In the autumn of 2021, Boris had just lost his mother, Charlotte, and a fine painter and a remarkable human being. He relied on her as much as anyone else alive. All who witnessed his distress at a funeral will testify. Who cares? Who cares that he lost his mother? Yes, it's a big shock to anyone, but you're the prime minister. He took on this job knowing full well the pressures that would be on him. We know he hated it almost instantly within 3 months, even before the pandemic had hit, how much he hated being the prime minister because he had to take decisions. He had to take choices he did not want to make. And Boris hated making decisions. He would have cabinet meetings and just go right then and leave before anyone could ask questions or anything like that. Again, the person most responsible for the downfall of Boris Johnson is Boris Johnson. So, with COVID still a mortal threat, there was no time to mourn his beloved mum. Again, I think making excuses there for Boris Johnson. But the bereaved Boris then went on to make some unforced errors. Oh, unforced errors. They began with the Owen Paterson affair, when personal loyalty blinded him to the optics of favouring a friend who had broken parliamentary rules. He broke parliamentary rules. You tried to save him, and it looked incredibly bad. Congratulations. It's not optics to try and repay your loyalty. No, he broke the rules. You shouldn't have even gone anywhere near him. Anyone else would have gone nowhere near him. But no, Boris tried to save Owen Paterson. In the end, he has not only lost his chum, but a by-election and accused of the chumocracy too. Hard on the heels of this setback came the excruciating saga of his foes' cherished Partygate. Again, Partygate cut through. Partygate happened. It was not a thing. It was not trivial. No one believes this was all happened during lockdown, and we know now that there's a ton of stuff that is coming out from the diaries. All this stuff, the parties at Chequers, the ABBA parties. There were more parties than than have been, shall we say, revealed so far, and there's more potentially coming out. So Boris can certainly be faulted for the mismanagement of Downing Street during lockdown. Well, at least I'm glad you would admit that. As Mayor of London, Boris had been surrounded by a small but excellent team, to whom he had delegated his administrative duties and he found unpalpable. You're the Mayor of London. Delegating your administrative duties, while again might make good sense as a leader sometimes, doesn't really set a good example for how you should act as Prime Minister. And people were warning about that at the time. People were warning about how much the pressure of being PM is going to affect Boris, that he's going to screw up continuously. And oh, look, what happened? He screwed up continuously. So Downing Street was a much bigger organ of the body politic than City Hall. However, and Boris was not the first incumbent to find it ungovernable. Ah, there you go. Oh, it wasn't just Boris, it was just the fact that number 10 was just completely ungovernable. So, due to the unprecedented scrutiny that Boris Johnson inevitably attracted, however, his efforts to try and maintain morale, oh, that's what it was. He was trying to maintain morale at number 10 during the grim night watches of the pandemic were reaffirmed by hostile commentators as a national disgrace. Absolutely was a national disgrace. You had people throwing up. You had fights in number 10. The entire Sue Gray report reads not as a working office in our politics, but more as a report on a frat house. It is and always was a national disgrace. And the fact that you are trying to defend Boris from that, saying, oh, these were just morale boosting parties. No, they absolutely weren't. So a new narrative was fashioned out of Gossamer to try and suggest it had been one rule for the Prime Minister and another for everyone else. Well, that wasn't appeared out of nowhere. That was exactly what had happened. It did appear as if it was one rule for the Prime Minister and another for everyone else. So the police investigated the breaches of the COVID rules at Downing Street seemed to corroborate this story. Boris himself received just one fixed penalty notice for an impromptu birthday party, at which he had been present for a few minutes but never even had a piece of cake. But in the mind's eye of the British public, the image of a stricken Boris close to death in St. Thomas Hospital was systematically erased. Again, we knew that did not happen. That is a complete untruth. Instead, we were bombarded with lurid pictures of Johnson's lockdown jollies, often contrasted with the somber light of the late Queen sitting alone at her husband's funeral. Exactly. And it wasn't just one party. There were numerous photos of these parties and Johnson being at them and accounts, even in the Sue Gray report. So, this artful switching of imagery to accomplish what no speeches by Keir Starmer could ever have done, the donation of the popularity he'd always enabled Boris to try and defy the political gravity. Enter the Mandarins. And of course, this is again, oh, it wasn't Johnson. No, Johnson knew about these parties. We knew he was the instigator of many of them. He broke the rules, and it was one rule for him and one rule for everyone else. So, enter the Mandarins, adept at backstabbing. Our great United Kingdom is actually entirely run by a lady called Sue Gray, the head of ethics or something or other in the Cabinet Office, Sir Oliver Letwin. It is she whom Boris entrusted the whole official report on Partygate, notably mainly for its failure to produce anything resembling a smoking gun. Oh no, there were photos. We've had eyewitness accounts that there was plenty of smoking guns, and we keep on getting more. It's like you're a detective and you're trying to find out who is the murderer, and yet some guy keeps coming up to you, handing you smoking guns, like literally handing you the murder weapon, going, "Here you go, here you go, here you go." So what followed was an antagonizing period as a wounded PM saw his support slip away. the Pincher affair, in which the deputy chief witch, Chris Pincher, belatedly resigned after allegedly groping two men in a London club. I don't think that was allegedly, I believe at the time. So again, fact check on the word allegedly, definitely in this article, certainly needed. This was the last straw. Boris, who had known of similar complaints against Pincher when he was appointed, tried to manfully save his government, only to resign as the party leader with a typical Hollywood flourish, hasta la vista baby. And of course, next we know those couple of weeks that you're conveniently laying out, the fact that you had Sajid Javid, Rishi Sunak resign, saying, well, we can't do this anymore, because again, time and time again, whenever Boris had lied, all these MPs had gone out to try and defend Boris on the media round. Same for Sunak and Javid. They'd done the same for Chris Pincher, saying we'd been told this, only to be told, no, you're lying. We know you're lying because here it is. And they were fed up of it. They couldn't go on with the lying that Boris Johnson was doing, so they resigned. And then, of course, this triggered resigning after resigning after resigning. Some people being given positions, staying in for literally minutes, and then resigning, saying, you cannot lead. And then, of course, he was finally flushed out of number 10 with his infamous hasta la vista baby. Just a bit of context for you that much missing. And of course, meanwhile, back in the real world, outside SW1, a huge Russian army had invaded Ukraine, unleashing the bloodiest war in Europe since 1945. Unlike the establishment, which had, as usual, ignored the warning signals, Boris was ready. No, Boris was not ready. We know from, again, inside information that Boris had no intention of supporting Ukraine. It was Ben Wallace who marched into his office and said, you will support Ukraine or else I will resign. And I will cause trouble for you from the backbenchers for not supporting it. And this is why Ben Wallace is still very, very popular in the Conservative Party. So, yeah. And again, establishment, which ignored the warning signs. No, a lot of people had seen the warning signs coming, but if anything, it was the Conservatives who continued to take Russian money, who continued to ignore things like the Russian report. You know, those things maybe might be quite important, but there you go. So while Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz were trying to appease Putin and Joe Biden, they wanted Vladimir Zelensky to flee. But the British provided arms and, of course, trading that enabled Ukraine to win the battle for Kyiv. No, it was not Britain alone that did that. The US provided weapons as well. In fact, probably more at that time than the UK was providing. So, no, it was not just British arms. It was also British, but more specifically, American arms that went on to help win the battle. And also training. No, the CIA and America had been helping to train, and especially NATO in particular, had been helping to train the Ukrainian army for quite some time before that. Again, missing out huge points of what really happened there. But again, it's the Daily Mail. Should we be really surprised? So, recognizing a man after his own heart in the Ukraine president, Boris rose to the occasion. It should be a matter of patriotic pride that he took the lead on Ukraine, persuading our allies to give Zelensky the tools to finish the job. Again, everyone ended up supporting Ukraine. Even if Boris Johnson hadn't been there, there would still be very, very much sort of the same support for Western support for Ukraine that you see now. So, along with getting Brexit done, setting the course on Ukraine, and will be remembered as one of Boris's greatest achievements. Probably not, because again, as I said, I think Ben Wallace will very, very much come out and, shall we say, set the record straight eventually one day on what really happened there. We won't actually have, well, these are the rumors, these are what we know apparently went on inside Downing Street. I'm waiting for that with a great, great hopes one day. So, Scarcely less the controversial at the time was Boris's early decision, early in the pandemic, to throw everything at developing a COVID. Oh, here we go, a COVID vaccine that would be cheap, effective, and British. Again, not British, not solely British, shall we say? And again, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was the result. Rather than follow the bureaucratic European model, again, not true. We could have done all this regardless and didn't even need Europe's say so or anything like that. British regulators worked in parallel with scientists. Again, no one in Europe was stopping them from doing that at the time. The vaccine was rolled out by a team led by brilliant men and women from the private sector, Dame Katie Bingham. Again, other countries rolled out very similar things, did very similar things, and guess what? They had a quicker vaccine rollout than us. Denmark springs to mind instantly when this comes up, and also countries of equivalent size. Germany later than us in terms of issuing the vaccine, but again, faster vaccine rollout than us. Anyway, let's try and finish this off. So where are we? The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was a British triumph. Again, not just a British triumph. It saved millions of lives around the world, and Boris Johnson deserves some of the credit. No, he actually absolutely does not deserve any credit for developing because he had no part in that. Already in his miracle career as a journalist, he's demonstrated the aptitude to try and get to the heart of the matter. Uh, Boris has always been a visionary statesman. No, he hasn't. He has an eye for the big picture, seldom for the details. And again, ultimately, that was his downfall because you don't have to have an eye for the big picture. You also have an eye for the details as being the prime minister. I think Boris has very clearly proven that. Um, but there was a place in British politics, surely, for his quote, visionary thing. And certainly for the force of nature, such as Boris. Despite his background as an Etonian and Oxford, he has preserved his role as the eternal outsider. Boris has never been a House of Commons man, even when, as now, he might have been in his interest. Well, Boris only acts in his own interest regardless. When he first made his foray into politics during the Blair era more than 2 decades ago, I predicted in print that Boris would be the next prime minister. But in two, he was, in fact, the next but three. Having stood far above the field as Mayor of London, Boris similarly outclassed his rivals as stage as Prime Minister. Uh, he won't. He'll go down in history probably one of Britain's worst Prime Ministers, but again, thanks to Liz Truss, who currently holds that honour. Some of them will be gloating now, but the country will rue the day when the most gifted statesman of his generation felt obliged to turn his back on Parliament. Oh dear. Oh, the acrimony. Um, Britain can ill afford to cold shoulder leaders capable of mastering the imminent threats of artificial intelligence, immigration, climate change, and China. Boris had no plan to sort out any of those whatsoever. He had no plan. The idea again, this idea that if Brexit had gone perfectly and there'd be no pandemic, there would be no war, that Boris would be this absolutely amazing prime minister on course to win yet another historic election landslide is complete and absolutely bogus. Boris Johnson brought down Boris Johnson, and even if you say the pandemic never happened or Brexit went all Boris's way, and that the war in Ukraine never happened, Boris Johnson would have taken out Boris Johnson. That was always going to happen. So we shall miss Boris Johnson with his wicked wit and unruly hair. We shall miss his blithe spirit, who accompanied us through dark times. But we shall not miss the undefying spectacle of a true leader drummed out of public life. Or certainly Boris Johnson was never, ever a true leader. He never once led in his entire life. Like I say, he would rather let other people make the decisions for him. And again, there's a lot of context missing of what was going on at that time in this article. I'm sure the people will say, well, you missed this and this and this. But to be honest, there's just so much missing there. But again, it's the Daily Mail. I think we can expect them to be a little, shall we say, cut and dry with the truth. But as always, doesn't surprise me that the Daily Mail, of course, would cry over the loss of Boris Johnson. I suspect there will be many other right-wing papers probably also crying over Boris Johnson today. And I look forward to Conservative Home to see what their reaction, because oh boy, are we going to go over their reaction. That'll be interesting to see where they come down on Boris Johnson's resigning. Currently, at the moment, it's all quiet over there, but we'll see what happens. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. As always, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. The link's down below to my Patreon page, the donation link where you can buy a coffee. Also, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club as well. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, we'll see you all next time.